The Red Tent by Anita Diamante, Part 1, My Mother's Stories. Chapter 1. Their stories began with the day that my father appeared. Rachel came running into the camp, knees flying, bellowing like a calf separated from its mother. But before anyone could scold her for acting like a wild boy, she launched into the breathless yarn about the stranger at the well, her words spilling out like water into sand. A wild man without sandals, matted hair, dirty face. He kissed her on the mouth, a cousin, son of their aunt, who watered sheep and goats for her and told off the ruffians at the well. "What are you babbling?" demanded her father, Laban. "Who is come to the well? Who attends him? How many bags does he carry?" "He is going to marry me," said Rachel, matter-of-factly, once she had caught her breath. "He says I am for him, and that he would marry me tomorrow if he could. He's coming to ask you." Leah scowled at this announcement. "Marry you?" she said, crossing her arms and throwing back her shoulders. "You won't be marriageable for another year," said the older girl, who, only a few years older than Rachel, already acted like the head woman of her... Gotta turn the page. I don't have a page turner. Of her father's small holdings. A 14-year-old mistress of Laban's house was like to take a haughty maternal tone with her sister. "What's all this? And how did he come to kiss you?" This was a terrible breach of custom, even if he was a cousin, and even though Rachel was young enough to be treated as a child. Rachel stuck out her lower lip in a pout that would have been childlike only a few hours earlier. Something had happened since she opened her eyes that morning, when the most pressing matter on her mind had been to find the place where Leah lit her honey. Leah, that donkey, would never share it with her, but hoarded it for the guests, giving taste to pathetic little Bilha and no one else. All Rachel could think of now was the shaggy stranger whose eyes had met hers, and a shocking recognition that had rattled her to the bone. Rachel knew what Leah meant, but the fact that she had not yet begun to bleed meant nothing to her now. Her cheeks burned. "What's this?" said Leah, suddenly amused. "She is smitten. Look at her. Have you ever seen a girl blush before?" "What did he do to you?" asked Laban, growling like a dog who sensed an intruder near his herd. He clenched his fists and beetled his brow and turned into his full attention to Rachel, the daughter he had never once hit, the daughter whom he rarely looked at in full face. She had frightened him from her birth, a tearing, violent entry that had killed her mother. When the baby finally emerged, the women were shocked to see that she was such a small one, a girl at that, who had caused so many days of trouble, costing her mother so much blood and finally her life. Rachel's presence was as powerful as the moon, and just as beautiful. No one could deny her beauty, even a child who worshipped my own mother's face. I know that Leah's beauty paled before her younger sisters, and that a knowledge that had always made me feel like a traitor, but still denying it would have been like denying the sun's warmth. Rachel's beauty was rare and arresting. Her brown hair shaded into bronze. Her skin was golden honeyed, perfect. In that setting, her eyes were surprisingly dark, but not merely dark, but brown, but black. Her polished obsidian of the depth of a well, although she was small-boned, and even when she was with child, a small-breasted woman. She had muscular hands and a husky voice that seemed to belong to a much larger woman. I once heard two shepherds arguing over which was Rachel's best feature, a game I too had played. For me, the most wonderful detail of Rachel's perfection were her cheeks, which were high and tight on her face like figs. When I was a baby, I used to reach for them, trying to pluck the fruit that appeared when she smiled. When I realized that there was no having them, I licked her instead, hoping for a taste. This made my beautiful aunt laugh from deep in her belly. She loved me better than all her nephews put together, or so she said, and wove my hair into elaborate braids for which my own mother's hands lacked the patience or time. It's almost impossible to exaggerate the dimensions of Rachel's beauty. Even as a baby, she was a jewel upon whatever hip she bore her, from place to place. An ornament, a rare pleasure. The black-eyed child with the golden hair. Her name was Tuki, which means sweetness. All the women shared in Rachel's care after her mother, Huna, died. Huna was a skilled midwife known for her throaty laugh and much mourned by the women. No one grumbled about tending to Huna's motherless daughter, even though the men for whom babies held little fascination as cooking stones would stoop and run a calloused hand across her remarkable cheek. They would rise, smelling their fingers and shaking their heads. Rachel smelled like water. Really. Wherever my aunt walked, there was a scent of fresh water. It was impossible, an impossible smell, green and delightful, and in those dusty hills the smell of life and wealth indeed. Indeed, for many years, Laban's well was the only reason his family hadn't starved. There were hopes early on that Rachel would be a water witch who could find hidden wells and underground streams. She did, turning the page, sorry guys. She did not fulfill that hope, but somehow the aroma of sweet water clung to her skin and lodged in her robes. Whenever one of the babies went missing, more often than not the little stinker would be found fast asleep on her blanket, sucking his thumb. No wonder Jacob was enchanted at the well. The other men had grown accustomed to Rachel's looks, and even to her startling perfume, but to Jacob she must have seemed like an apparition. He looked directly into her eyes and was overcome. When he kissed her, Jacob cried out with the voice of a man who lies with his wife. The sound woke Rachel out of her childhood. There was barely time for Rachel to describe their meeting before Jacob himself appeared. He walked up to Laban, and Rachel watched her father take in his measure. Laban noticed the empty hands first, but he also saw that the stranger's tunic and cloak were made of fine stuff. His water skin was well crafted. His knife hilt was carved of polished bone. Jacob stood directly before Laban, and dropping his head, proclaimed himself, "Uncle, I am the son of Rebekah, your sister, the daughter of Nahor and Milcah, as you are their son. My mother has sent me to you. My brother has chased me to you. My father has banished me to you. I will tell you the whole story when I am not so dirty and weary. I seek your hospitality, which is famous in the land." Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but Leah yanked her sister's arm and shot her a warning glance. Not even Rachel's youth would excuse a girl speaking out when the men were addressing one another. Rachel kicked at the ground and thought poisonous thoughts about her sister, the old bossy crow, cross-eyed goat. Jacob's words about Laban's famous hospitality were a courteous lie, for Laban was anything but pleased by the appearance of his nephew. Not much caused the old man pleasure, and a hungry stranger were unwanted surprises. Still, there was nothing to be done. He had to honor the claim of his kinsman, and there was no denying the connection between them. Jacob knew the names of Laban, recognized his sister's face, and of the man standing before him. "Ah, you are welcome," Laban said without smiling, or returning to his nephew's salute. As he turned to walk away, Laban pointed his thumb at Leah, assigning her the task of seeing to this nuisance. My mother nodded and turned her face to the first grown man, who did not look away when confronted by the sight of her eyes. Leah's vision was perfect. According to one of the more ridiculous fables embroidered around my family's history, She ruined her eyes by crying a river of tears over the prospect of marrying my uncle Esau. If you believe that, you might also be interested in purchasing a magical toad that will make all who look upon you swoon with love. My mother's eyes were not weak, or sick, or rheumy. The truth is, her eyes made others weak, and most people looked away rather than face them. One was blue as lapis, and the other green as Egyptian grass. When she was born, the midwife cried out that a witch had been brought forth, and should be drowned before she could become a curse to the family. But my grandmother, Ada, slapped the stupid woman and cursed her tongue. "Show me my daughter," said Ada in a voice so loud and proud that the men outside could hear her. Ada named her last born Leah, which means mistress, and she wept a prayer that this child would live, for she had buried 7 sons and daughters. There were plenty who remained convinced that the baby was a devil. For some reason, Laban, who was the most superstitious soul you can imagine, spitting and bowing whenever he turned to the left, howling at every lunar eclipse, refused to hear suggestions that Leah would be left outside to die in the night air. He swore some mild oath about the femaleness of this child, but apart from that, Laban ignored his daughter and never mentioned her distinction. Then again, the woman suspected the old man could not see color at all. Leah's eyes never faded in color, as some of the women had hoped that they would. They became brighter in their difference, and even more pronounced in their strangeness when her lashes failed to grow. Although she blinked like everyone else, the reflex was nearly invisible, so it seemed as if Leah never closed her eyes. She even her most loving glance felt a bit like a stare of a snake, and few could stand to look straight in her eye. Those who could were rewarded with kisses and laughter and bread wet with honey. Jacob met Leah's eyes straight on, and for this she warmed to him instantly. In fact, Leah had already taken note of Jacob on account of his height. She was a half a head taller than most of the men she'd ever seen, and she dismissed them all because of it. She knew this was not fair. Surely there were good men among those whose heads only reached to her nose. But the thought of lying with anyone whose legs were shorter and weaker than her own disgusted her. Not that anyone had asked for her hand. She knew that they all called her the lizard and evil eye, or worse. Her distaste for short men had been confirmed by a dream in which a tall man had whispered to her. She couldn't recall his words, but they had warmed her thighs and woken her up. When she saw Jacob, she remembered the dream, and her strange eyes widened. Jacob noticed Leah with favor too. Although he was still ringing from his encounter with Rachel, he could not ignore the sight of Leah. She was not only tall, but shapely and strong. She was blessed with full, high breasts and muscular calves that showed to a good advantage in the robes that somehow never stayed closed at the hem. She had forearms like a young man's, but her walk was that of a woman with promising hips. Leah had dreamt once of a pomegranate split open to reveal 8 red seeds. Zilpa said that the dream meant she would have 8 healthy children, and my mother knew that those words to be true, the way that she knew how to make bread and beer. Leah's scent was no mystery. She smelled of the yeast she handled daily brewing and baking. She reeked of bread and comfort, and, it seemed to Jacob, of sex. He stared at this giantess, and his mouth watered. As far as I know, he never said a word about her eyes. My Aunt Zilpa, Laban's second-born, said that she remembered everything that ever happened to her. She laid claim to the memories of her own birth, and even the days of her mother's womb. She swore she could remember her mother's death in the red tent, where she sickened within days after Zilpa arrived in the world, feet first. Leah scoffed at these claims. though not to her sister's face, for Zilpa was the only one that could cause my mother to hold her tongue about anything. Zilpa's memory of Jacob's arrival is nothing like Rachel's or Leah's, but Zilpa had little use for men, whom she described as hairy, crude, and half human. Women needed to make women needed men to make babies and to move heavy objects, but otherwise she didn't understand their purpose, much less appreciate their charms. She loved her sons passionately until they grew beards, but after that she could barely bring herself to look upon them. When I was old enough to ask what it was like on the day that my father arrived, she said that the presence of El hovered over him, which is why he was worthy of notice. Zilpa told me that El was the god of thunder, high places, and awful sacrifice. El could demand that my father cut off his son, cast him out to the desert, or slaughter him outright. This was a hard, strange god, alien and cold, but conceited, a consort powerful enough for the Queen of Heaven, who she loved in every shape and name. Zilpa talked about gods and goddesses, almost more than she spoke about people. I found this tiresome at times, but she used the words in the most wonderful ways. I loved the stories about Ninhursag, her great mother, and Enlil, the first father. She made up grandiose hymns in which real people met with deities, and together they danced to the sound of flutes and cymbals, singing to them in a high, thin voice to the accompaniment of a small clay drum. From the age of her first blood, Zilpa thought of herself as a kind of priestess, the keeper of the mysteries of the red tent, the daughter of Asherah, the sister of Sidori, who counsels women. It was a foolish idea, as only priests served the goddesses of the great city temples, when the priestesses served gods. Besides, Zilpa had none of the oracle's gifts. She lacked the talent for herbs. She could not prophesy or conjure or read goat entrails. Leah's 8-seeded pomegranate was the only dream she ever interpreted correctly. Zilpa was Laban's daughter by a slave named Mernephat, who had been purchased from an Egyptian trader in the days when Laban still had means. According to Ada, Zilpa's mother was slender, raven-haired, and so quiet it was easy to forget that she had the power of speech, a trait her daughter did not inherit. Zilpa was only a few months younger than Leah, and after Zilpa's mother died, Ada gave them suck together, and they were playmates as babies, close and loving friends as children, tending the flocks together, gathering berries, making up songs, and laughing. Apart from Ada, they needed no one else in the world but each other. Zilpa was almost as tall as Leah, but thinner and less robust in the chest and legs. Dark-haired and olive-skinned, Leah and Zilpa resembled their father and shared the family nose, not unlike Jacob's, a regal hawk's beak that seemed to grow longer when they smiled. Leah and Zilpa both talked with their hands, and thumb and forefinger pressed together in emphatic ovals. When the sun made them squint, identical lines appeared around the corners of their eyes. Where Leah's hair was curly, Zilpa's black mane was straight. She wore it to her waist. It was her best feature, and my aunt hated to cover it. Headdresses caused her head to pound, and she said, putting a hand to her cheek with a silly drama, even as a child I was permitted to laugh at her. These headaches were the reason she gave for keeping so much inside the women's tents. But she didn't join the rest of us to bask in springtime sun or to find the breeze on a hot night. But when the moon was young, slender and shy, barely making herself known in the sky, Zilpa would walk around the camp, swaying her long hair, clapping her hands, offering songs to encourage the moon's return. When Jacob arrived, Bilha was a child of 8, and she remembered nothing of that day. She was probably up in a tree somewhere, sucking on her fingers or counting the clouds, said Leah, repeating the only thing that was remembered by Bilha's early years. Bilha was the family orphan, the last daughter born of Laban's seed. She was the child of a slave named Tefnut, a tiny black woman who ran off one night when Bilha was old enough to know she had been abandoned. She never got over that hurt, said Zilpa with great gentleness for Zilpa's respected pain. Bilha was alone among them. It was not just that she was the youngest, and that there were three other sisters to share the work. Bilha was a sad child, and easier to leave alone. She rarely smiled and hardly ever spoke, not even to my grandmother Ada, who adored little girls and gathered motherless Zilpa to her inner circle, and doted upon Rachel, who could warm the strange lonely bird, who never grew taller than the boy of 10 years old, whose skin was the color of dark amber. Bilha was not beautiful like Rachel, or capable like Leah, or quick like Zilpa. She was tiny, dark, and silent. Ada was exasperated by her hair, which was springy as moss and refused to obey her hands. Compared to the two other motherless girls, Bilha was neglected dreadfully. Left to herself, she climbed trees and seemed to dream. From her perch, she studied the world, the patterns of the skies, the habits of animals and birds. She came to know the flocks as individuals, giving each animal a secret name to match its personality. One evening she came in from the fields and whispered to Ada that the black dwarf she-goat was ready to give birth to twins. It was nowhere near, um, turning page, it was nowhere near the season for goats to bear, and that particular animal had been barren for 4 seasons. Ada shook her head at Bilha's nonsense and shooed her away. The next day Laban brought news of a strange event in the flocks, with the precise retelling of the little girl's prediction. Ada turned to the girl and apologized. Bilha sees clearly, said Ada to the other daughters, who turned to stare at this unseen sister and noticed for the first time the kindness in her black eyes. If you took the time to look, you could see right away that Bilha was good. She was good the way milk is good, the way rain is good. Bilha watched the skies and the animals, and she watched her family too. From the dark corners of the tents, she saw Leah hide her mortification when people stared. Bilha noticed Rachel's fear of the dark and Zilpa's insomnia. Bilha knew that Laban was every bit as mean-spirited as he was stupid. Bilha says her first clear memory of Jacob is from the day his first child was born. It was a boy named Reuben, and of course Jacob was delighted. He took his new son in his arms and danced the baby around and around outside the red tent. He was so gentle with the boy, Bilha said. He would not let Ada take Reuben away from him, even when the little one began to wail. He called his son perfect and a miracle in the world. I stood beside him and Jacob together, and I worshipped the baby. We counted his fingers and stroked the soft crown of his head. We delighted in him and in each other's joy. Bilha said, "That is when I first met Jacob, your father." Jacob arrived late in the afternoon in the week of the full moon, and ate the simple meal of barley bread and olives, and he fell into an exhausted sleep that lasted through most of the next day. Leah was mortified by the simplicity of the food they had offered him at first, so the next day she set out to produce the feast seen only in great festivals. "I suffered over that meal like nothing else I'd ever cooked," said Leah, telling me of the story of during a dull hot afternoon while we rocked the narrow neck jars, straining the water from the goat curd. "The father of my children was in the house. I was sure of it. I could see he was smitten by Rachel, whose beauty I saw as if for the first time. Still he looked at me without flinching, so I hoped. I slaughtered a kid, an unblemished male, as though it were a sacrifice to God. I beat the millet until it was soft as a cloud. I reached deep into the pouches where I kept my most precious spices, and used the last of my dried pomegranate. I pounded, I chopped, I scraped in frenzy, believing that he would understand that what I was offering to him. No one helped me with the cooking. Not that I would have permitted anyone else to touch the lamb or the bread or even the barley water. I wouldn't let my own mother pour water on into the pot, she said and giggled. I loved this story, and I asked to hear it again and again. Leah was always reliable and deliberate, and far too steady to be giddy. And yet, as she recounted her first meal for Jacob, she was foolish and weepy girl. I was an idiot, she said. I burned the first bread and burst into tears. I even sacrificed a bit of the next loaf so that Jacob might fancy me, just as we do when we bake the cakes for the Queen of Heaven on the seventh day. I broke off the piece of the dough, kissed it, and offered it to the fire as an offering of hope that the man would claim me. Don't ever tell Zilpa about this, or I'll never hear the end of it, said Leah in a mock conspiratorial whisper. And of course, if was Laban, your grandfather, had any idea of how much food I put in together for the beggar who showed up without so much as a jug of oil as a gift, he would have flogged me. But I gave the old man enough strong beer that he made no comment. Or maybe he made no mention of my extravagance because he knew how lucky he'd, how he'd be lucky with his kinsman. Maybe he guessed that he had, turn the page, discovered a son-in-law who would require little by the way of a dowry. It was hard to know what the old man knew and didn't know. He was like an ox. An ox? That ox was your grandfather. Like a post, I said. Like a cooking stone, said my mother. Like a goat turd, I said. My mother shook her finger at me as though I were a naughty child, but then laughed out loud. For raking Laban over the coals was a great sport among his daughters. I can still recite the menu. Lamb flavored with coriander, marinated in soured goat milk, with a pomegranate sauce for dipping. 2 kinds of bread, flat barley and raised wheat, quince compote, and figs stewed with mulberries, fresh dates, olives, of course. And to drink, choice of sweet wine, 3 different beers, barley water, and barley water. Jake was so exhausted he nearly missed the meal. Leah brought forth with so much passion. Zilpa had a terrible time waking him up, and finally had to pour water on him, which startled him so badly that he swung out one of his arms and knocked it to the ground, where she hissed like a cat. Zilpa was not at all happy about this. Jacob. She could see that his presence had changed things between the sisters, and that would weaken their bond to Leah. He offended her, because she was so much more attractive than the older men. He was so much more attractive than the older men they saw, foul-mouthed shepherds, and occasional trader who looked at the sisters as though they were a pack of ewes. Jacob was well-spoken and fair of face, and when he met Leah's gaze, Zilpa understood that their lives would never be the same. She was heartsick and angry and helpless to stop change, though she tried. When Jacob finally awoke and came to sit at Laban's right side of the tent, he ate well. Leah remembered his every bite. He dipped into the lamb, stew over and over again, and he had 3 helpings of bread. I saw he liked sweets, and that he preferred the honeyed brew to the bitter-flavored drink that Laban gulped down. I knew how to please his mouth, she thought. I will know how to please the rest of him. This line would always get my mothers shrieking and slapping their thighs, for although she was a practical woman, Leah was also the lewdest of the sisters. And then, after all the work, after all that eating, what do you think happened? Leah asked, as though I didn't know the answer as well as I knew the crescent-shaped scar above the joint of her right thumb. Jacob grew ill. That's what happened. He vomited every morsel. He threw up until he was weak and whimpering. He cried out, and he asked for his blessed mother to save him from his agonies or let him die. Zilpa, the brat, she sneaked into the trench to see how he fared, and reported back to me, making it sound even worse than it was. She told me that he was whiter than the full moon, that he barked like a dog and spewed frogs and snakes. I was mortified and terrified too. What if he died from my cooking? Or just as bad, what if he recovered and blamed me for his misery? When no one else showed any ill effect from their meal, I knew that it wasn't the food. But then, fool as I was, I started worrying about my touch was hateful to him. Or maybe I'd done something wrong with the bread offering, not giving homage to God, but as an attempt at magic. I got religious again and poured out the last good wine in the name of God the healer. That was on the third night of the suffering, and he was healed by the next morning. At this she shook her head and sighed. Not a very auspicious beginning for such fruitful lovers, was it? Jacob made a quick recovery and stayed on week after week until it seemed that he'd always been there. He took charge of the scrawny, turning the page, of the scrawny herds, so Rachel no longer had to follow the animals, a job that had fallen to her in the absence of brothers. My grandfather laid the blame on the state of the herds and his dwindling wealth upon the fact that all his sons had died at birth or in infancy, leaving him nothing but daughters. He gave no thoughts to his own sloth, believing that only a son could turn his luck around. He consulted the local priest, and who told him to sacrifice his best rams and a bull, so that the gods might give him a boy child. But he had lain with his wives and concubines in the fields, as an old midwife suggested, and all he ever got for that effort was an itchy backside and bruises on his knees. By the time Jacob arrived, Laban had already given up hope of a son or any improvement in his life. He expected nothing from Ada, who was past childbearing and sick. His other his other three women had died or run off, and he couldn't afford with the few coins for a homely slave girl, much less the price of a new bride. So he slept alone, except for the nights that he found his way up to the hills to bother the flocks. Ew, like some horny little boy, Rachel said among the shepherds. My grandfather's lust was legendary. The ewes run like gazelles when Laban walks up the hill. The daughters despised him for 100 reasons, and I knew them all. Zilpa told me that when she was just a few months away from her first blood, the task fell to her of taking my grandfather for his midday meal. And he reached up and put his thumb and forefinger around her nipple, squeezing it as though she were a she-goat. Leah, too, said Laban had put his hand under her robes, but when she told Ada, my grandmother, she beat Laban with a pestle until he bled. She broke the horns of his favorite household god, and then threatened to curse him with boils and impotence, and he swore never to touch his daughters again, and made restitution. He bought gold bangles for Ada and all his daughters, even Zilpa and Bilha, which were the only time he acknowledged them as kin. He brought home a beautiful Asherah, a tall pillar nearly as big as Bilha, made by the finest potter he could find. The woman placed her up on the bema, a high place where the sacrifices were offered. The goddess's face was especially lovely, with almond eyes and an open smile. We poured wine out over her in the dark of each new moon, and it seemed to us her mouth broadened even further with pleasure. But that was some years before Jacob came, when Laban still had a few bondsmen working for him, and their wives and children filled the camp with cooking smells and laughter. By the time my father arrived there was only one sick wife and 4 daughters. While Laban was glad enough of Jacob's presence, the two men disliked each other heartily. Although different as ravens and donkey, they were bound by blood and soon by business. Jacob, it turned out, was a willing worker with a talent for animals, especially dogs. He turns Laban's 3 useless mongrels into shepherds. He whistled and the dogs raced to his side. He clapped and they would run in circles and get the sheep to move for him. He yelled, he yodeled, and they stood guard with such ferocity that Laban's flocks never again saw harm from a fox or jackal. And if there were poachers, they ran off rather than face the barred teeth of that fierce little pack. Jacob's dogs were soon the envy of other men who offered to buy them. Instead, he traded a day's worth for a stud of the male cur with cunning wolfish eyes. When the smallest of our bitches bore the wolf's dog's litter, Jacob trained her puppies and traded 4 of the 5 for what seems a mountain of treasure, which he quickly converted to gifts that proved how well he had come to understand Laban's daughters. He took Rachel to the well where they had met and gave her the blue lapis ring she wore until the day she died. He sought out Leah, who was combing wool, and without a word handed her 3 fine hammered gold bangles. To Zilpa he gave a small votive vessel in the shape of Anita, who poured libations through the nipples. He laid a bag of salt at Ada's swollen feet. He even remembered Bilha with such tiny amphoras of honey. Laban complained that his nephew should have turned over the profit from the puppies directly to him, since the mother was his goods. But the old man was mollified by a bag of coins, which he ran to the village and bought back Rudy, the poor thing. Within a year, Jacob had become the overseer of Laban's domain with his dogs. Jacob led the flocks so that the lambs fed on gentle grass, the sheep grazed on patches of juicy herbs, and full-grown rams rummaged through the tough weeds. The flocks did so well that at the next shearing Jacob had to hire 2 boys to finish the work before the rains came. Rachel joined Leah, Zilpa, Bilha in the garden, and they were enlarged with wheat patch. Jacob made Laban agree to sacrifice 2 fat lambs and a kid to the God of his father as thanks for the bounty. Leah baked raised cakes from the precious stock of wheat for the sacrifice too, which was carried out by Jacob directly. In the manner of his fathers, he burned the entire loaves with all choice parts of the animals rather than a few portions. The women muttered among themselves at the waste. It was a year of change for my family. The flocks multiplied, the grain flourished, and there was a marriage in the offing. For within a month of his arrival, Jacob asked Laban about Rachel's bride price, and she had said that he would the very first day. Since it was clear that his nephew had no means or property, Laban thought he could get the man cheap, and made arrangements, a magnanimous show of offering his daughter for a mere 7 years' service. Jacob laughed at the idea. 7 years? We're talking about a girl here, not a throne. In 7 years' time she might be dead. I might be dead. Most likely of all, you could be dead, old man. I will give you 7 months, Jacob said, and for the dowry I will take half of your miserable herd. Laban jumped to his feet and called Jacob a thief. You are your mother's son, all right, he raged. You will think the world owes you something. Don't get too proud with me, you afterbirth, or I'll send you back to your brother's long knife. Zilpa, the best spy among them, reported on the argument, telling how they haggled back and forth over my aunt's value, about how Laban stormed out and Jacob spat. Finally, they agreed on the year's service for a bride price. As to dowry, Laban pleaded poverty. I have so little, my son. he said suddenly with as a loving patriarch. And she is such a treasure. Jacob could not accept the bride without a dowry. That would have made Rachel a concubine and him a fool for paying a year of his life for a girl who only had a grindstone, a spindle, and clothes on the back. So Laban threw in Bilha to the bargain, giving Rachel status as a dowered wife, and Jacob the possibility of a concubine in time. Also, you must give me 1/10 of the lambs and kids born to the flocks as I stand guard over them for you during the year of my service, Jacob said. At that, Laban cursed Jacob's seed and stormed away. It was a week before the men finished their negotiations, a week in which Rachel wept and carried on like a baby while and Leah said little and served nothing but cold millet porridge and food for mourners. When they worked their final terms, Laban went to Ada so that she could start planning the wedding, but Ada said no. We are not barbarians who give children to wed. Rachel could not even be promised, she told her husband. The girl might look ready to marry, but she was still unripe, having not yet bled. My grandmother's claim that Anath would curse the garden of Laban dared break this law, and that she herself would find the strength to take a pestle to her husband's head again. But threats were unnecessary. Laban saw the advantage in this delay, and went immediately to Jacob with the news that would have to wait until the girl was ready before he could plan a date for the marriage. Jacob accepted the situation. What else could he do? Furious, Rachel yelled at Ada, who cuffed her, who told her to take her temper elsewhere else. Rachel in turn slapped Bilha and cursed Zilpa and snarled at Leah. She even kicked the dust at Jacob's feet, calling him a liar and a coward before bursting into her pretty tears on his neck. She began to nurse dark fears about the future. She would never ever bleed, never marry Jacob, never bear sons. Suddenly the small hide breasts of which she had been so proud seemed puny to her. Perhaps she was a freak, a hermaphrodite, like a gross idol in her father's tent, one of those tree stalks between her legs and teats like a cow. So Rachel tried to rush in her season. Before the new moon, she baked cakes of offering to the Queen of Heaven, something she had never done before, and slept a whole night with her belly pressed up against the base of Asherah. The moon waned and the grew round, while Rachel's eyes remained dry. She walked into the village by herself and asked the midwife Ina for help, but was given an infusion of ugly nettles that grew in the nearby wadi. But again the new moon came, and Rachel remained a child. As the following moon waned, Rachel crushed bitter berries and called her older sisters to help her see the stain on her blanket, but the juice was purple, and Leah and Zilpah laughed at the seeds on her thighs. And the next month Rachel hid in her tent and did not even slip away to find Jacob. Finally, in the 9th month after Jacob's arrival, Rachel bled her first blood and cried with relief. Ada, Leah, and Zilpah sang the Piercy 30 song that announces births, deaths, and a woman's ripening. As the sun set on the new moon, when all the women commenced bleeding, they rubbed henna on Rachel's fingernails and on the soles of her feet. Her eyelids were painted yellow, and they slid every bangle, gem, and jewel they could be found onto her fingers, her toes, ankles, and wrists. They covered her head with the finest embroidery and led her to the red tent. They sang songs for the goddesses, for Inanna and the Leda Asherah of the sea. They spoke of Bilha, the mother of 70 gods, including Anita and in that number, the nursemaid, defender of mothers, they sang, whose fairness is like the fairness of the beauty is now in your womb. You bear the power of... I can't say the names of these gods anymore. The women sang all the welcoming songs to her while Rachel ate date honey and fine wheat flour cake made into three-cornered shapes of women's sex. She drank as much wine as she could hold. Ada rubbed Rachel's arms and legs, back and abdomen with aromatic oils until she was nearly asleep. By the time they carried her out into the field where she was married to the earth, Rachel was stupid with pleasure and wine. She did not remember how her legs came to be caked with earth and crusted with blood, and smiled in her sleep. She was full of joy and anticipation, lazing in the tent for 3 days, collecting precious fluid into a bronze bowl, for the first moon blood of a virgin was powerful libation for the garden. During those hours she was more relaxed and generous than anyone could ever remember her being. As soon as the women rose from their monthly rites, Rachel demanded that the wedding date not be set. No, Rachel demanded that the wedding date be set. None of her foot stamping could move Ada to change the custom of waiting 7 months from first blood. So it was arranged. Although Jacob had already worked a year for Laban, the contract was sealed, and the next 7 months were Laban's too. That's the end of chapter 1. Catch you next time on chapter 2. I'm so tired. I just woke up and I haven't even had coffee yet. Shabbat shalom, y'all.